So our next speaker is Peter Hofmann. He's a PhD student at the Deutsche Telekom, Chair of Communication Networks at the Technical University of Dresden. So today, he will discuss neural communication, a pathway towards synthetic biological intelligence.
Okay, thank you for the nice introduction. And yeah, welcome to my talk. Hopefully you are not too tired after the lunch. So hopefully I can motivate a bit the pathway from communication to computation. So I will introduce a bit neuronal communication, but I will more focus on the pathway towards synthetic biological intelligence. So in general, talking about a physical neural network. Where does it come from? So within or with in the in December, January and November last year, I was in Australia for a research day, and I visited a company which works basically in research on synthetic biological intelligence. And I will just show you some initial results. I will show you some stuff I learned there, and yeah. Showing you some insights into the research in synthetic biological intelligence. So what's the outline for today? First of all, I will define some terms, some abbreviations, which I may use during the talk, that you are getting familiar with it. Then I will talk about computing in the 21st century. So why do we need different approaches for computing beyond silicon-based computing approaches? Next, I will talk about the fundamentals on neuronal communication and computing. So how does it work? How does it work in general? Going to synthetic biological intelligence at Cortical Labs. So Cortical Labs, that's the name of the company in Australia, which I visited during my research stay. Then I will explain you how to interact with a physical neural network. So it's really a neural network which you can basically touch in the lab. And finally, talking about my small research project, which was controlling an inverted pendulum. So most of you may have heard of an inverted pendulum and how to control it. So it's a classical control problem. And I will show you some insights how to do it with the real physical neural network. So first of all, some abbreviations which I may use during the talk. Just to let you know what it means. Most of them are well known, like AI or MC for molecular communications. I think the last one that's maybe new for you, which is SBI for synthetic biological intelligence. So if I may use SBI during the talk, it stands for synthetic biological intelligence. Okay, let's delve into the topic. First of all, motivating computing in the 21st century. So why should we go beyond silicon-based computing approaches? Why there's need for other approaches for computing in the 21st century? And essentially, there are three problems. And I will start with the first one. So first of all, there's an exponential data growth over the last years. So this figure shows the data generated in zettabytes per year over the last 15 years. And as you can see, there was a huge increase. So for example, starting in 2010 with 2 zettabytes per year up to an estimated value of approximately 180 zettabytes per year in 2025. So as you can see, there's an exponential data growth, and what relates to this data growth is energy. So most likely you have heard of Google or Amazon, which built reactors next to their big server centers, right? To gain some energy or to produce their own energy. So if we connect the data growth, or if we connect data and energy, we need Landau. So maybe you have heard of Rolf Landauer. There's the Landau limit, which basically is the relation between information theory and thermodynamics. So, and if you connect it, so you basically scale the data produced per year with the Landauer limit, which is KB times T times ln2 for 1 bit. So that's the lower limit for if you want to delete 1 bit. KB is the Boltzmann's constant, T is the temperature. And if you scale it with the data generated per year, you can plot the red line and for the utilization of only digital CPUs, CPUs. And as you can see, if you plot in parallel simultaneously the world energy production, you will hit the wall almost in the 2030s. So more or less, there is the need for alternatives for different approaches for computing. Most likely you have also heard of NVIDIA. They are also having a huge range of different GPUs. They are more powerful and more energy efficient. So even if we use digital GPUs, as you can see, of course, we will further shift the wall, but nevertheless, we will hit it in the 2050s. And we believe that if we include new platforms like analog computing or biological computing, we can further shift the limits. So first of all, there's the energy problem. We have a problem that due to the data generated or the exponential data growth over the last years, we will hit the energy walls within the next years. And that's why there's the need for new platforms or for including new platforms into our communication networks, because from our point of view, communication networks not only include the transport of data or of information, but also storage and computing, for example. So that's why also for communication engineers, it's important to think about computing in communication networks. I mentioned that there are three limits in total. The first one is the energy problem. And secondly, there's the computability problem. So Holger, he was here yesterday. He published several works with Gita and Adalbert, for example, from Munich, that there are some limitations for specific problems that you cannot solve on digital hardware. So there's also the need for alternatives in different or for computing as specific computations are limited or specific algorithms are limited on digital hardware. And finally, there's a legal problem. So if we think about algorithms or the design of algorithms, for example, under specific constraints, there are some requirements from the European Union. So there's the so-called European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, where more or less it's predefined that your algorithm has to be transparent. So that's also a limitation that we have, and that's the third problem. So with including new platforms, we want to target these three limits or these three problems: the legal problem, the energy problem, and the computability problem. So now, as I already mentioned, we think or we believe that alternative computing approaches can solve these problems. I will talk about biological, or more specifically, biohybrid computing in this talk. Of course, there's also analog computing, there's maybe quantum computing, there's neuromorphic computing. So there are different approaches. This talk focuses on biohybrid computing and especially on neuronal computing. So basically developing or growing a physical neural network in vitro and stimulating the physical neural network with electrodes so that you have a biohybrid computing chip. Hybrid because, of course, there are some electrodes, and bio because there are the real physical neurons. And before delving into more details, some fundamentals for those of you who haven't heard of neuronal communication. So basically here you can see two neurons. So they are marked in orange. So there are two neurons, neuron A and neuron B. And there's the axon in between, which is some kind of a wire. So you can imagine there's a wire in between. And when neurons grow, also the axons will grow. So I will show you a picture from a lab in a minute where you can see the real physical neural network. And as you can see, there's the neuron cell, and there are a lot of axons connecting more or less the neurons. So it's some kind of a network. It's a biological network, but nevertheless, it's a wired network in that sense. And if you think about some kind of message transmission in the network, if we assume there's a stimulation of neuron A, there's an electrical signal traveling or propagating through the axon to neuron B, and there's a so-called synaptic cleft in between. And if the electrical signal comes to the synaptic vesicle, there are some more or less molecules, to so call it, which will be released. They travel through the synaptic cleft to the other side, more or less. And if the electric stimuli is high enough, more or less, also neuron B is stimulated. And that's the basic principle also for the biohybrid chip. So basically, you stim at a specific region and you read the output in another region, for example. So it's some kind of a spiking neural network, but with the difference that it's a real physical spiking neural network. And to give you guys some more insights, as already mentioned, I visited Cortical Labs in Australia 2 months ago. They are focusing on producing their own computing units for biohybrid computing. I will also show you a picture in a minute. And of course, they are also doing research. So they have some collaborations, for example, with Monash University. You have heard it in previous talks. They have collaborations with University of Melbourne. Of course, working also on research, but besides, they are a company and they want to sell their computing unit in the future. So first of all, the question is, how can I more or less grow, or how can I develop a real physical neural network? So how can I produce the biohybrid chip? So here you can see some kind of a guideline how to do it. So if you want to do it at home, it's a bit complicated, but nevertheless, this is some kind of a guideline. So first of all, there's a volunteer donor, which donors in the end some kind of blood. And given the blood, you can culture it in a lab. So there's some kind of reprogramming that you can gain some stem cells. So basically you start with stem cells, for example, from the human being, but of course they are also using some stem cells from, for example, monkeys or from mice. So that's also possible. If you have the stem cells, you go on with a so-called differentiation. And finally, you have a so-called neural rosette, which is basically some kind of the starting form, to so call it, to gain in the end 2 different types of neural or physical neural networks. So first of all, there's a neural monolayer, which is some kind of a 2-dimensional network. So you can imagine, or you can basically imagine it as some kind of, let's say, a sheet of paper. So it's 2-dimensional. And in difference, there are also some neural organoids, which is basically like a synthetic brain. So it's a 3-dimensional structure. And depending on the structure which you want to have, there are 2 different methods. Honestly, I'm not an expert in these methods, but basically there are 2 different ways how to do it, depending on what you wanna use in the end. Nowadays, Cortical Labs mainly works with monolayers, but of course they are also they are also testing some organoids. So I also tested some organoids during my research stay. But nevertheless, of course, there are still some issues because there are some uncertainties working with organoids. Here, as mentioned, you can see a picture from a microscope of the real in vitro grown neural network. So as you can see, the scale is 100 micrometers. And basically here you can see all the axons, right? And these are the cells. And yeah, in general, it's like a wired network. So one could imagine that it looks like a wired network. And basically you stim the network at different locations and read the output. So that's the idea of the chip. And in the end, which I will also explain in a minute, there are different methods how to teach something. Because if you just stim it, right, the network or the physical neural network won't learn anything. So you need some kind of algorithm or technique to teach something. Finally, as already mentioned, Cortical Labs tries to more or less sell their own computing unit. So that's a picture or more or less an animation of the first prototype. And I don't know, maybe some of you have been to the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, which took place, I think, 2 weeks ago. And they showed a server rack with like 20 of these units in Barcelona. So basically, they really have the prototype. So you can, within maybe within the next 1 or 2 years, you can basically most likely buy one of these units. And within the unit, there's, of course, the chip. So there's the biohybrid chip where you have the real physical neural network. And besides, you need some kind of perfusion circuit because there's the need for some media change. As they are living cells, right? You cannot just lay them on top of the table because they will die. So you have to change the media and you have to keep constant conditions. So you have to keep the temperature, for example, humidity and so on. So that's why, of course, you need some kind of circuit or you need some kind of system to keep the cells alive or to feed them. Just to show you how it looks. So the unit is approximately in this size. So it's like, I don't know, 40 centimeters. So it's not that big, but of course it's not like a small chip which we have in our mobile phones or which we have in our laptops. But nevertheless, that's not the idea. So the idea is not to use biological computing approaches in your smartphones in 5 years or in 10 years. That's more like an addition for maybe specific computations which have specific requirements. Now, I talked about the basics. So how to produce, for example, the neurons, how to grow them in the lab. The question is, how can we interact with a physical neural network? So how does it work? So first of all, depending on the project or the problem we are working on, there's an input. Then there's some kind of encoding. Then we have the process, of course. There's some decoding, output, and the neural network or the biohybrid chip is some kind of a closed loop feedback system. So that's why, of course, we also have some feedback going back to the input. So we can basically adapt the input based on the output. Going into more details. So first of all, Cortical Labs got famous for their paper on playing the arcade game Pong. So maybe you have heard of the game. So there's a ball and there's a paddle, and you try to hit the ball. And they published a paper 4 years ago, I think, where they showed that the neurons or that their neural network is able to play the Pong game. So that was one of their first publications. So if we go back to this slide, so more or less the input is, for example, the location of the paddle or maybe the location of the ball itself. So that's basically the input. The question is, how can we encode? Currently, there are two different ways to do it. So first of all, we have space. So you can imagine here that some kind of a Rubik's Cube, for example. You have space because you have, maybe I can toward here. You have some kind of a multi-electrode array. So let's say it's 3 times 3 times 3. You have the channels. And on top of this multi-electrode array, you have the neurons. So for example, maybe there's a neuron. So it looks similar. I'm not really good in drawing some things, but basically you have the multi-electrode array, and on top of the array, you have the neuronal, or you have the neural network. So basically you can encode in space, which means you can stim specific channels, which means, for example, if the ball is, I don't know, top right, I stim channel 3, just to give you a simple example. In addition, you can also encode in time, which means you can not only stim channel 3 once, you can stim channel 3 twice, for example, and there's a time interval in between of, I don't know, 0.2 seconds or whatever. Or you can change the frequency of your stimulation. So there are different options how to do it. And of course, you can also combine space and time. So that's basically how the encoding works. For the feedback is based on the free energy principle, which means, I think I will go to this slide, that every living organism tries to minimize the free energy. What does it mean? So I think this is a bit too complicated. We don't have to go into the details, but to give you a simple example. If you think about your schedule for example, for tomorrow, you know, you have to get up at 8, you go to the conference at 9, you know, there's lunch at 12. I don't know what's your schedule for tomorrow, but basically, if everything goes well, you're relaxed. So if you know, okay, I have to go to the train at 3 and the train is on time, everything is fine, right? But if something happens which is not planned, right? You will feel maybe uncomfortable, for example, and that's similar to the neurons. What does it mean for the feedback? So basically, if you stim the neurons with some kind of predictable stimulation, they like it. So that's some kind of reward for them. If you stim them with some kind of random stimulation, which means you randomly stim some channels or you randomly choose the frequency, they don't like it. So that's some kind of punishment for them. And in that sense, you can provide feedback to the system. So if we go back to the Pong example, right, where you try to hit where you try to hit the ball with the pedal, right? If you hit the ball, then of course it was the right decision to move the pedal, for example. So you feed in the reward, which means you input some kind of, or you stim in a predictable manner. If you miss the ball, right, because the pedal is too high or too low, I don't know, then you stim randomly some channels, or you stim a random set of channels, you choose randomly a frequency, and in that way you can teach something. So that's basically the feedback. And finally, for the decoding, there are different ways how to do it. I will only explain, or I will only show you one way of doing it, and that's counting the number of spikes. So as mentioned some slides ago, if you stim the neural network at, for example, channel 1, and then you count the number of spikes at channel 9, you know more or less how the information propagates through the network. That's not always the case because it's not a predictable system. So the problem is that sometimes, as the neural network also grows or adapts to the stimulation, that if you have the same input today and tomorrow, the output today and tomorrow will be different. So that's some kind difficult, but nevertheless, basically for the decoding, you count the number of spikes per channel, and then you apply some filter, because naturally there are also some spikes. So that's why use, for example, a filter to only count the number of spikes which occur after the stimulation or after a specific stimulation. And then in the end, you can reduce the network because you only use these neurons which are representative of a specific stimulation. And to show you how it looks in real time, I have a short video sequence for you. So basically here, you can see the multi-electrode array of the chip. So which means it's 8 times 8. So there are basically 64 electrodes, so 64 channels. And for every channel, there's some kind of a rectangle for every channel. And you can see the output of the channel in real time. And what you can see here, sometimes, I'm not sure if you can, restart. So sometimes there's some kind of a light blue spike. So that's the stimulation. So now you can see it with a specific frequency, for example, or with a specific amplitude. And if the rectangle gets gray, that's the spike coming from the system. So that's basically the output. And in the end, you more or less implement some algorithms to count the spikes, using some error wedging window filters, for example. So basically, that's how it looks in real time. So that's real time. Okay. Now we talked about how the encoding works, how the decoding works, how the feedback works, basically. And finally, I will talk about a small project, which is controlling a physical pendulum. So most likely, you know the physical a physical version of the inverted pendulum. So maybe you've seen some machines like these, where you have the pendulum and you try to balance it. And that's the visionary goal, to control the physical inverted pendulum using the neurons. But as there are some problems to control a real physical system, we decided first of all to start with a virtual version, because basically that's more easy than the physical version. So we implemented a two-dimensional version of the physical pendulum. So basically the pendulum itself is fixed at the red dot, and can move to the left and to the right. But nevertheless, you apply a torque, so you try to somehow balance the pendulum. So that was the goal, using the real physical neural network. Of course, there are some more boundary conditions. For example, that there's some kind of boundary condition on the left and on the right, because then the pendulum is not able to recover, because then it has to go down before going up. But first of all, we neglect this effect. Here you can see an overview of the multi-electrode array, which we used for stimulating, or also for encoding and decoding the input and output. And what we did was, if the pendulum was on the right side, we stimulated one region. If the pendulum was on the left side, we stimulated the other region. So that was basically our first approach. And you can see it here in dark red and dark green. These are the two regions which we stimulated for either being left or being right. For the output, we read out with L and R marked cells, because you cannot directly read out the neighboring cells, because sometimes due to the stimulation, if you read out the neighboring cells, you have some kind of influence. So that's why you are only, or more or less, it's better to only read out the diagonally neighboring cells. And for the feedback, more or less, if the decision was right, so if you go back to our system model, what means right or wrong decision in our case? If we assume having a state like you can see it here, if the pendulum is on the left side, if the output from the system says more or less go to the red dashed line, which is the upright position. That's the right decision, more or less. So we increase the angle. There's a reward. If the pendulum moves down, then there's a punishment. And for the reward, we were using the light red and light green cells because they are directly connected to the stimulation regions. And for the punishment, we were using the blue cells. So we randomly chose a set of cells in these two regions for the punishment. Now presenting you some initial results. As already mentioned, we faced some issues due to working with living systems. So as already mentioned, if you input or if you write an algorithm for the stimulation and also for reading out or for the interpretation of the output, if you do it today and if you do it tomorrow, the output is different. Because the cells are growing, the network adapts to your stimulation, and of course there are also different types of cells. So you can basically grow in vitro different types of brain cells, which have a different functionality. So that's why, more or less, sometimes there are some lucky punches. Like this one. So this was one of our first trials. What do we plot here? So first of all, that's the cycle. What does it mean? So we start the simulation with an almost upright position. And if the pendulum moves to our boundary condition, we restart the whole cycle in the end. So we go back to an almost upright position, and then we restart the stimulation. And on the vertical axis, you can see the number of time steps. What does it mean? The higher the number of time steps, the longer we can balance the pendulum. And as you can see, there's a significant increase over time, and also the lower bound increases over time. But yeah, as mentioned, it was the first trial, and we tried to produce some reproducible results. So that was the goal. And unfortunately, you can see that it changes every time. So this is the result, or this is the plot for some later obtained results. And as you can see, for example, here the lower bound is more or less constant. So it does not increase over time. What we in addition did here, so if you compare the two plots, here we only plot blue dots. In comparison here, we have red and blue dots. Why? Because we were interested in the movement of the pendulum. So red and blue denotes the end position of the pendulum. So red means it goes to the left, blue means it goes to the right. And as you can see, the pendulum moves more or less more to one side. What does it mean for the physical neural network? So if we, for example, go back to the video I showed to you, right? And if you compare the video with, for example, the figure I showed to you with the regions which we stim, sometimes some regions are more active than other ones. So you need some kind, or you have to implement some kind of bias to somehow neglect these effects. But nevertheless, these are some ongoing results. So we are we are still working, or we are still collaborating with cortical labs, trying to improve these results, and of course, trying to more or less balance the real physical pendulum within hopefully a few years. To show you some outliers maybe. So here in that case, we were able to almost balance the pendulum for 2.5 seconds. So in the upper plot, you can see the angle over time, and in the lower plot, you can see the angular velocity over time. And as you can see, especially for the angular velocity, it more or less alternates between minus 0.25 and plus 2.5, which means the pendulum moves to the left and to the right before going finally down. If you compare it with a so-called test chip, so without any neurons, I think I don't have the plot here, but basically the pendulum just moves down to one direction. Maybe just one more side note. So here I mentioned that we more or less were interested in the end position of the pendulum. So if it moves to the left or to the right, every 10 runs, more or less, we change the starting position of the pendulum. So what does it mean? So as I already explained, we started in an almost upright position, and every 10 runs we change it. So it means we start for 10 runs almost upright, but slightly shifted to the left, and after 10 runs almost upright, but slightly shifted to the right. But nevertheless, the pendulum still moves to one side. I think this was one of my last slides. Maybe to summarize it a bit, that's still ongoing work. So we are trying to produce some reproducible results, and of course, the ultimate goal is to balance the real physical pendulum, and also to work on some, let's call it, maybe problems which cannot be solved on digital hardware, where biological or biohybrid computing approaches are maybe performing better compared to digital approaches, or where we can some kind of provide some add-on for nowadays silicon-based computing architectures. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. I have a couple of questions. One is slide 25. If you go there, yes. How did you come up with this pattern?
Yeah. So we tested different approaches because there's no framework or manual. So you cannot use the same more or less structure every time. You have to test it several times. So I don't know how many tests we did, and this was one of the more or less structure which works better than other ones.
Because the neurons, they are growing at random, right?
Yeah.
And so does this apply only to one grown specific neural community, neural culture? And that was kept alive for all your experiments?
So we tested different cultures. And as mentioned, different cultures were performing differently. But nevertheless, as you mentioned, this more or less structure works best for one culture. But nevertheless, for other cultures, maybe another structure is better.
Okay, that's very interesting. Okay. The second question is, have you heard about Final Spark?
No.
That's another company that wants to do the same exact thing, but it's based in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. And I've been looking at them because I wanted to establish a collaboration with US, but because it's a outside US company, I have a lot of problems. internally in US because they want an American company for collaborating on a project. But it's very compelling. My last question is, so you talked about a lot of advantages for biocomputation or biohybrid computation with respect to just using electronics. So do you think also biocomputation can offer something that electronics cannot offer at all with respect to functionality?
I think yes. Honestly, I'm currently not sure what it could be.
What's your intuition? Since you work on that, I am curious about what's your intuition looking forward.
So what Cortical Labs does, or what we did while I've been there, they are also working with testing different drugs. So for some medical applications, for example, testing different approaches, using more or less the synthetic brain as some kind of test thingy. So maybe this could be something. Of course, I think it's really energy efficient. So I mean, currently it's more like a biohybrid system. So you still have some electrodes, you read the output, and so on. So you need some electronics. But nevertheless, the neurons itself are really energy efficient. So maybe this could also be something which could be beneficial in the future. But yeah, nevertheless, as you already mentioned, there are some issues you have to more or less target before or within the next years. And there are a lot of them. So currently, for example, to give you some more insights, there's no memory. What does it mean? We did some tests where we stimulated the physical neural network, and after more or less 30 minutes, you can test different algorithms, and basically they won't recognize something. But that's something they are working on, and maybe some kind of a memory function works within the next years.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how far, well, we are far, but how far we are from a system that has some form of self-conscious and self-aware. Well, of course, there is no memory yet and everything, but obviously it would be interesting to add on top and then reconstruct a brain, a complete brain, even if it's a very rudimentary brain, but a brain that can be kind of self-aware, which then would have a lot of ethical implication, but obviously, those things have to be also discussed. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a question concerning the schemes. So the schemes, from the feeling, it should be more or less symmetric, every scheme. This one is not so symmetric. There's some part which is this little things there. Is it in general that it's more symmetric or more or less symmetric?
Yeah, it depends what you want to do, but usually you go for some
for the pendulum.
Yeah,
so
usually you go for some symmetric structures or schemes. Of course, you can see the dash here, right? That's due to the electronic structuring of the whole system. So you cannot stim every channel, basically. So that's why there's the dash, because you are not, or basically you cannot stim channel 64, for example. But nevertheless, for this system, if you have, or for the system model, as you only have two inputs, of course, there's a symmetric scheme. But nevertheless, I talked a bit about encoding. If you have more than, or if your set of inputs is bigger than two, for example, of course, you have to think about different encoding schemes, because here it's basically just yes or also left or right. Let's explain it like this. But nevertheless, for every region, in addition, you also encode in time. So you stim for a specific time with a specific predefined frequency. So you have some kind of space encoding, but also timing-based encoding. But nevertheless, as mentioned, if you have more inputs or your input set is bigger, then of course you have to combine it in a hybrid manner.
Maybe to come back to the question, can you solve something that you cannot solve with other computers? Because in the beginning you claimed that you will address the computability issue. So I mean, if you satisfy a stronger notion of computability, or like a computing model which can compute more, then you would. But do you?
Not yet. So currently it's more, let's say, basic research. So we're trying to somehow test several things. But yeah, we don't know what comes maybe in a few years. So we are testing different approaches, and of course it was like a visionary motivation. So yeah, let's see what we can do within the next years.
Perhaps the question is, then you mentioned the work of Holger. So what they do is somehow they show us that something is not computable by a Turing machine, but in that case, they could show that it's computable by a Bloom-Schup's mail machine. You have hopes that this one can act like a Bloom-Schup's mail?
Maybe yes. I don't know, honestly. So yeah, as mentioned, it's more like basic research, but nevertheless, that's also one point we want to target within some projects we have within future research. And yeah, as mentioned, we are still, we are further collaborating with Cortical Labs to also trying to maybe answer or work on these questions.